This show is part of the Darkmoor Podcast Network.
To join our community Discord or see more content from our members, visit darkmoorpodcasts.com.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Dragon Mind, the TTRPG podcast where we discover our best selves through gaming. Today, we're continuing our D&D 2024, 2025 Practical Possibilities coverage with the 2025 Monster Manual, as well as the balance of all three new D&D Core Rulebooks as a set. If you want to contact me directly, you can message me in the Darkmoor Podcast community Discord or email me at dragonmindpodcast@gmail.com, all linked in the description below. The 2025 Monster Manual is the third and final core rulebook for the latest version of D&D, rounding out the content begun with the Player's Handbook and Dungeon Master's Guide. If you've been on the fence when it comes to purchasing these latest releases for whatever reason, I will say that the Monster Manual is the one I can confidently recommend even if your table doesn't plan on moving away from 2014's player rules. In my opinion, the stat blocks are easier to use and more accurately do what you expect, with some fun surprises still left in them to be discovered. Like the other core books, Todd Kenreck has released some preview interviews with Jeremy Crawford and Wesley Schneider. Out of both their discussions and Todd Kenreck's discussions with Chris Perkins about the Dungeon Master's Guide, the new Monster Manual seemed to be designed with three goals in mind. First, creatures should feel like they're CR. Jeremy Crawford explained that although this meant increasing their hit points and damage output, it also meant designing their action economy in a way where any route led to balanced performance. For example, in 2014, the Archmage was a CR12 enemy with over 20 spells in its stat block. If used with its strongest options right out of the gate, it could present a moderate challenge for 4 level 12 characters, and be deadly for lower level characters. However, it also had 99 hit points, an AC of 15, assuming the DM used mage armor, and a +2 initiative. Having run this Archmage stat block right as is, I can tell you that more often than not, even a level 5 party could just roll high on initiative and deal it 99 damage before it used any of its high-powered spells. It had the potential to be a CR12 creature, but simple stats like hit points, armor class, and initiative often meant it was dead before it could do anything fancy. Even if it got the chance, a DM would need to be careful about which spells to use in order for it to hit for its CR. If a DM just used Firebolt or Magic Missile, which the Archmage had prepared, it wouldn't be a CR12 threat. To compare, the 2024 Archmage has an AC of 17, 170 hit points, and a +7 initiative. In addition, it can either make 4 Arcane Burst attacks, which are melee or ranged with a +9 attack bonus that each deal 27 force damage on average, or cast level 7 lightning bolts or level 9 cones of cold. Low-key, it just occurred to me that in the previous Archmage stat block, I was supposed to be casting these AoEs with higher level spell slots. I never did. Speaking of spell slots, there is no spell slot management in the new stat blocks. The lightning bolts and cones of cold are twice per day or once per day respectively. Because they're not using spell slots, there's also no interference with the Archmage using Misty Step as a bonus action, making it much more mobile, and it can react with Counterspell or Shield up to 3 times per day. What was once a laughably underpowered creature now feels like a threatening final boss. Again, along with the bumps to numbers, it's really the action economy that makes it a threat. The formatting makes it more obvious than ever that the Archmage can be this CR12 threat with just Arcane Bursts and Misty Step. The second goal is that the encounter building guidelines in the DMG should be a simple budget using each creature's XP. Having listened to a good number of reviews of this product, Most creators speak about the new content in terms of impressions. You'll hear critics say, monsters hit harder, monsters are deadlier, monsters look cooler, which we'll get into in a minute. However, there was some skepticism during the DMG previews when Chris Perkins and James Wyatt claimed that encounter building should be as easy as having an XP budget based on how many players there are and their levels, and just choosing monsters that add up to that budget. Between the 2014 DMG and Xanathar's Guide to Everything, there were so many systems in the first run of 5e for building encounters, including multipliers and variables, that I never even touched the system. To me, CR wasn't a helpful guide anyways, as I just mentioned with the Archmage as an example. So with the base power level being inaccurate, I wasn't going to do a bunch of math to end up with an encounter that was even more wildly different in challenge than I expected. So rather than just talk about my impressions, I actually ran some test combat encounters to judge the accuracy of the new encounter building rules. Of course, these are far from comprehensive and don't encompass all possibilities of what could happen at your table. Before I get too far into it, I want to say, I did my best to use the rules as written. There were no custom items or variant rules that I used. I tried to just stick with content from the 2024 Player's Handbook, 2024 Dungeon Master's Guide, and 2025 Monster Manual. I ran 4 characters, all at level 13. The reason I picked 13 is because that's the level that my player characters are at in my ongoing campaign. And it's the level I was nervous about running. I feel like I have a good enough grasp on the game's math from levels 1 through 10, where I'm confident about designing encounters. But once we start moving past level 12, things get a little dicier. Ha ha! As for characters, I tried to play a variety of classes and species. I built a Tiefling Vengeance Paladin with a Maul and the Topple Weapon Mastery, a Wood Elf Land Druid, a Dwarven Abjurer Wizard, and finally my go-to character, Solomon Blackedge, a multi-classed human dex-focused combination of Wildheart Barbarian, Battlemaster Fighter, and 4 Elements Monk. Now I did use magic items. I used the magic items table in the DMG to distribute 2 legendary magic items, 3 very rare items, and a set of rare and uncommon items. I initially wondered if the magic item equipment would push things in the player's favor. It did not. For each encounter, I tried to have each group of enemies feel thematically tied, using groups I could see myself using in actual stories. The first encounter was against a Beholder with 4 Ropers. It was 600 XP over budget for a moderate difficulty encounter, but between my Baldur's Gate and 5e experience, I thought it wouldn't be too bad. Again, I was wrong. This party TPK'd after 5 rounds. Initially, what did them in was that the Beholder first rolled a Death Ray against the Druid. Then, on a legendary action on the turn after, rolled another Death Ray and killed them outright. From there, the Beholder successfully applied 2 Petrify Rays to both the Paladin and Solomon multiclass, leaving the Abjurer Wizard alone against 3 Ropers and the Beholder. It was a great example of how the fight was lost due to conditions and bad saves, not necessarily being outdamaged. Initiative also played a huge role here. In 5e, Beholders had a +2 initiative bonus, while this new Beholder has a +12. It was only second in the initiative order because the Wizard rolled a nat 20 and had a higher total. Like I said, rules as written, nat 20s on checks are technically a variant rule. What was interesting was how this high-level encounter felt like a chess match. The Wizard opened with Wall of Force, cordoning off 2 of the Ropers, leaving the fight functionally between the 4 player characters and 3 opponents. However, the Beholder then rolled a Disintegrate Ray on its first turn, targeting a piece of the Wall of Force and leaving a hole for the trapped Ropers to escape through. I've heard a lot about how buffed melee characters have gotten and how broken the Topple Weapon Mastery is. Well, in this fight, the Paladin was fighting a hovering boss, meaning Topple didn't do anything, and was constantly pulled away from the beholder by the ropers. There was a constant calculation about whether the beholders or the ropers should be targeted first. And unfortunately, I don't think either decision really mattered. It was the beholder's eye rays that did the party in. Even accounting for the magic items handed to the party, rules as written, the encounter was greater than moderate difficulty, which is good because I went over budget in its design. If there were 3 ropers instead of 4 and the wizard was able to block off 2 of them at the outset, perhaps the fight would have gone in the party's favor. Which brings us to test fight number 2. The same party versus the Archhag. I've been looking forward to the Archhag stat block since it was first teased. It's a CR 21 Fey boss monster. That's also a great example of how the monster manual acts as a story inspiration. Anyways, I went in predicting that although it was a deadly encounter from an XP budget standpoint, the Archhag would lose to the party's action economy. I was also wrong. The Archhag's action economy is to use 2 Spectral Claws, which hit for 17 average force damage, but also automatically knock a target prone. Then it uses Cackling Wave, a 60-foot cone with a DC 22 dex save that deals 32 average lightning damage. That part isn't too bad, except that whether a creature succeeds or fails the save, they end up cursed as long as they were in the area. From there, the Archhag has a Witch Strike bonus action that automatically deals 4d6 lightning damage to any creature cursed by it. It wasn't any one feature that dealt damage. It was the constant Crackling Wave Witch Strike combo that kept knocking them down. Again, both Solomon and the Paladin were melee-focused characters. By automatically getting knocked prone, the Archhag could just move away from them faster than they could chase her down. If they really caught up to her, she could use Dimension Door as a legendary action to move 3-dimensionally. I actually think with a ranged character, the party would have stood more of a chance, but the nasty cherry on top was the Tongue Twister Reaction, a souped-up counterspell that prevents a targeted spellcaster from using the verbal components of spells. There was a point where the Paladin was knocked to 0. The Druid went to use Healing Word, but was countered and unable to use the verbal components of spells, leaving them unable to cast Shield for when the Archhag knocked them down with Spectral Claws. This was supposed to be a deadly encounter, and the party again lost. The last encounter was against a Rakshasa and 4 Helmed Horrors, this time coming slightly under budget for the design. And this is where this party got their first win. The Helmed Horrors didn't have the control effects of the Roper's tentacles, and although they had magic resistance, a pair of Chain Lightning spells from the wizard still wiped them out. The Paladin did get a chance to knock the Rakshasa prone, but it was the only saving throw it rolled. The new Rakshasa has greater magic resistance, allowing it to automatically succeed saving throws against magic, and attack rolls of spells automatically miss. I know many groups are experiencing slowdown due to the Topple weapon mastery, and I tend to be a very organized player. And from the design of these 3 encounters, Topple wasn't coming up a lot until this fight, where it was one of the only saving throws the Rakshasa made. This fight also highlighted just how nerfed the Paladin has become. As a Vengeance Paladin, my opening move was to use Vow of Enmity on the Rakshasa, using my bonus action and preventing me from using Divine Smite. When I did get the chance to Divine Smite on a later turn, it was great to roll the extra die of damage against a fiend, but because it was only 1, the damage curve felt noticeably flatter than when I've played Paladins in the past. Again, I think this will be a good thing in the long run, but I would understand if Paladin players were upset by this change, and the bonus action management that's now asked of them. All of this is to say that I think both the encounter building budget and magic item distribution tables are pretty accurate, from my limited experience so far. Of course, there will be variance. I don't think the Beholder would wipe that party so quickly, for example, but that had more to do with its specific petrifying ray and bad rolls than anything. If your table wants more difficult encounters, though, this book delivers. The final goal of this new monster manual is for story inspiration. The book hosts new art direction, showcasing each monster in the middle of the action rather than simply a full body image without a background. It shows how monster attacks look in the environments you might find them in, often alongside player characters to demonstrate their actual scale. For example, I never realized how big Goristros actually were until I saw the new artwork. Their stat block always said huge, but seeing just the creature independent of its environment just didn't click the same way as seeing it in a burning village chasing down helpless villagers. In addition, accompanying each creature is a Dark Souls-like epithet, such as how Mind Flayers are brain-eating Underdark tyrants, or Fomorians are cursed giants of the dark. It helps kick off their story and tactics in a memorable way. Many monsters also have tables with story ideas. Going back to Archhags, each Archhag has an anathema that the party must keep within 30 feet of it when reducing it to 0 hit points in order to actually kill it. Some example anathemas are a flower that only blooms when time stops, snow from the top of Mount Celestia, or a devil's tear. Like my discussion on Rel's system Distal, these short prompts serve to ignite the imagination while not being so specific that your mind has no room to fill in the details. In terms of mechanics, each monster is also more distinct, giving them specific story functions. For example, in the 2014 Monster Manual, many brute-type monsters had different lore, but functioned similarly, such as the Ogre, Hill Giant, and Cyclops. All of them were big monsters, with a melee and ranged option that did damage. While ogres aren't significantly different between their 2014 and 2024 versions, largely because at low levels the game has always been more balanced, hill giants can now knock a target prone with their melee attack and poison a target with their trash lob ranged attack. And cyclopses are now diviners, with their original stat block having a limited foresight reaction to impose disadvantage on an attack roll against it, and a new spellcasting CR10 Cyclops Oracle. Sure, they're all still big brutes, but their lore and function are far more distinct from one another now. Of course, as you've probably guessed, I think the design team has done a wonderful job achieving all three of these major goals. Having monsters meet the expectations that come with their challenge ratings, having an encounter budget that's fairly accurate, and providing fresh story inspiration for DMs, both new and experienced. Again, I've listened to a lot of reviews from other creators, and there have been a few criticisms that have commonly come up. I'll go through each of them and my thoughts on them, but I don't find any of them particularly damning. If anything, they're little things that may have made the product better. But as is, I see most of them as easy clickbait than truly significant missteps. First, the big quote-unquote controversy is that the Orc, Drow, and Duragar stat blocks have been removed from this book. There's a conversion table in the indexes with NPC stat blocks to use in their place. Jeremy Crawford's stated reasoning is that other humanoid player species, like elves or dwarves, don't have dedicated stat blocks either. There is speculation that these species, Orc, Drow, and Durgar, have represented the act of harmful real-world stereotyping in the past, and so they've been quietly removed to, ironically, avoid controversy. While Jeremy Crawford has revealed that the orcs and drow that players have gotten used to from the 2014 Monster Manual will appear in the upcoming Forgotten Realms setting box set, accompanied by the cultural context from which they're designed from, many have voiced their displeasure. Mike Shea from the Lazy RPG podcast has an in-depth take that's well worth the listen in his episode dedicated to the new Monster Manual. And the folks over on the Eldritch Lorecast suggested including stat blocks for all of the humanoid species, like elves and dwarves as well. Now, for those of you that have been following me since the beginning of the 1D&D playtest, you'll know that the design team's approach with orcs and drow in this book and the Forgotten Realms setting is how I preferred they introduce the Ardling. Release it in a setting-specific product with the cultural context that their story is supposed to be told in. With the Ardling, I didn't mind its mechanical balance, but I thought that it would be better served in certain settings more than others, and that ultimately the player's handbook wasn't the best place for it. I personally feel the same way about the Faerunian versions of Orcs, Drow, and Duergar. I like that those specific stat blocks are being released in a Forgotten Realms specific box set. Now, I would even go so far as to remove other player species from other supplements, like goblins, Aarakocra, and Gith. But hey, as Mike Shea said, we got what we got and there's no changing it now. Now, just as a reminder to cap off this little section, all three of those stat blocks, Orc, Drow, and Duergar, are in the 5.1 SRD. So you can still play with them and adjust some of their underlying math by using the NPC stat blocks as templates. So again, I understand why some people would get really upset by this. Personally, I don't really care. Another criticism of the Monster Manual is that it has several stat blocks that include spells from the player's handbook, with DMs expected to have a player's handbook open to reference them. Now, some reviewers call back to Monsters of the Multiverse, where there were some stat blocks with features that had spell-like effects, with the effects completely written out for them. Personally, as I was flipping through the different stat blocks and seeing what spells I was expected to use and remember, I didn't think any of them were all that complicated. For example, some of the red dragons can cast Fireball. Fireball, to me, isn't the most complicated spell. 20-foot radius sphere, dex save, 8d6 fire damage. Even if I didn't have those stats off the top of my head, I could see this being a pain if you're running random tables, but if you're preparing encounters, I think it's easy enough to just jot the notes down. 20-foot radius sphere, dex save, 8d6 fire damage. And even if you look at a complicated stat block, like let's go back to the 2024 Archmage. There are 15 spells that it has. That's a lot of spells to decide what to do with. And there's really only 2 or 3 of them that I'd use in a given combat encounter. Again, I would stick to Lightning Bolt and Cone of Cold, both of which are pretty straightforward in terms of their effect. Yes, the Archmage has scrying prepared. I'm not going to sit there at the table doing scrying in front of my players. It would be something that I'd have going on in the background. And however it's going to work, I'm just personally not going to halt the game to make sure I'm using scrying rules as written and not letting my players do things as I figure it out. I understand that it's a hassle to have spells and stat blocks that you have to look up. But again, a lot of the concern seems to be referencing things at the table and taking time, which can honestly be solved by either prepping notes, like a little, or a lot of these things you can just look up on D&D Beyond. Oftentimes when I play D&D, whether it's online or at an actual table, one of the reasons I don't mind devices is because I can just keep a tab open of what all these different spells do. So that way it's just a little bit faster for the game to keep running. This thing, there are tools available for us to do these things. And again, most of the spells aren't super complicated. You could easily take notes of what damage it deals or whatever most of the time. Anyway, another criticism has to do with the order that monsters appear. In 2014, monsters were grouped together by general group, then by family. For example, if I wanted to look up a green dragon, I'd first have to go to D for dragons, then find green dragons. Dragons is an obvious example, but there were other stat blocks that could be easily missed if you didn't know certain things about it. For example, the Glabrazu is a demon, so you'd have to know to first go to D for demon, and then within that subsection go to G for Glabrazu. However, if you didn't know it was a demon, you may get confused, flip to G, and no longer find it there. However, the 2024 Monster Manual is more alphabetic. Green dragons are under G, as well as Glabrazus. Some reviewers like it the old way. I have mixed feelings. With this new alphabetical listing, I have found that sometimes I'm looking at certain monster options with more intrigue than in 2014. That being said, I do miss my NPC appendix. Finding the Archmage, for example, meant that instead of going to A, it was under M for Mage. It makes sense why it would be there, but I much preferred knowing that there was an appendix for beasts and an appendix for NPCs. Again, we have the book. My whining isn't going to fix anything. Another point of change is that monsters that used to be female only, like banshees, hags, and succubi, now have male counterparts. Some, let's call them old school community members, hate this change for its mythological inaccuracy. Others praise this change for being progressive. Personally, I don't really care one way or another. Although Banshee in particular makes me giggle because the term translates to woman of the fairies. So while I don't mind having a male-female version of a loud ghost, the naming convention feels a little silly. I brought up the Banshee example to a few of my female players who tend to be politically progressive, and they responded by rolling their eyes and saying, "What? Are they going to have male hags now too?" Let's just say that whatever issue the design team was proud of addressing runs deeper than artwork, but it's also not likely to be addressed further than what we got. At the end of the day, complaints about it feel silly, since individual DMs are welcome to run the monsters the way they want anyways. I think what my players were rolling their eyes at was more the disproportionate pride the design team had in this choice relative to its actual impact. Alright, this next one is really stupid. Monster entries now have a section for treasure, supposedly to make it easier for DMs to generate loot for enemies the players have defeated. Except, way too many of them either say any or none, which isn't helpful at all. Of all the criticisms held against the new monster manual, I think this one holds the most water. If you want to get into the weeds and get the really specific number of monsters that just say whatever, any treasure, Bob World Builder has a whole video in his monster manual review explaining this. Again, it's just another example of how the design team's hype over this entry was disproportionate to the amount of effort actually put into it. The final thing I'd like to address and just end on is power creep. Depending on who you are, you may appreciate or loathe the power creep introduced in the 2024 Player's Handbook. Some classes, like Fighter, Rogue, and Monk, are undoubtedly more powerful than their 2014 version. Even early into the 1D&D playtest, the writing was on the wall that most characters would be more powerful. So one question floating around had to do with new monster stats. When the design team first claimed that the new monsters were more powerful than their 2014 versions, several reviewers asked, does this mean that the power creep is a wash? After all, if both players and monsters are each more powerful, will the game feel meaningfully different? Now, this line of logic has bothered me since that initial reveal, and continues to bother me as reviewers claim the same thing. Power on the player side means something different than power on the monsters. For players, it does mean damage, but really it also means choices. The new Monk isn't a drastic improvement just because of its increased damage curve, but because unarmed strikes can deal damage, grapple, or shove. Turn by turn, unarmed strike by unarmed strike, monks can distribute damage and conditions in a way no other class can. Rogues aren't more powerful because sneak attack deals more damage. They're powerful because cunning strike gives them more choices. Like I said, what makes monsters more powerful is raw stats. Armor class, initiative, and yes, damage output. They also have a cleaner action economy that lets them do more stuff than they could in 2014. Yes, both players and monsters are more powerful, but not only does power mean something different for players and monsters, the degree of power increase favors monsters. Increase to each isn't an automatic wash, and in fact, some builds and classes aren't as powerful as their 2014 versions. For example, playing a paladin in these test combats left me with the impression that paladins are less powerful than their 2014 versions, which, to reiterate, I don't think is a bad thing. Assuming you're just playing with these 3 core rulebooks, I think the Monster Manual is a much more balanced offering that delivers more engaging gameplay. If I only had one of the new books to recommend for a DM that has the original 2014 trio, this is the one I definitely choose. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. Dragonmind is a proud member of the Darkmoor Podcast Network. To discover more TTRPG content like this, visit darkmoorpodcasts.com. If you had any insights or questions, be sure to email us at dragonmindpodcast@gmail.com or post in our discussion channel in the Darkmoor Podcast community Discord, linked in the description below. Our theme song, J-Pop, is brought to you by Fesliyan Studios. You can check out more of their awesome work at fesliyanstudios.com. Have an awesome day, and remember, your story matters. Bye-bye now.
Well, Grimton, Morlinde and Ulrich are gone. We're in a new, unfamiliar land of Kolgafir. What's our first move?
Polaris, I'm not too certain, but I did hear Fishbelly talking about something.
Oh, yeah. With the Warlord's half-sister in a meeting.
Yeah, that's about the only lead we have so far. We haven't been here long. Might be worth checking out.
Seems like a plan to me.
Join us as our party explores an unforgiving region of the Cusp and allies with new party members in Arc 3 of Advantage, a 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons audio drama focused on storytelling and character development in the Darkmoor Podcast Network. Find us in your podcast app.